In a cramped London basement with peeling paint and a single bare bulb, a young man named Thomas Walter Jennings fiddled with wires and tiny knobs, armed with almost nothing except a few shillings saved, a borrowed soldering iron, and a stubborn hunger to make sound. He had no connections, no mentors, just the hum of electricity and a head full of ideas that would eventually change rock and roll forever. He would sit for hours, adjusting coils, twisting dials, and listening intently to every scratch, buzz, and hiss, because each sound told him something important about what he was creating. It was obsessive work, almost absurd to anyone watching, and the neighbors complained constantly about the noise coming from below. But in that tiny room, the first flickers of a revolution in sound began to spark, born from necessity and fueled by pure passion. By night, the basement smelled of warmed metal and varnish, and by day, the streets outside bustled with a world that barely knew his name, yet something stubbornly British was taking shape, ingenuity born from poverty, passion created from scarcity, not through one catastrophic moment but through slow, patient insistence. From the basement, Jennings moved into a small back alley workshop where light from dusty windows fell on benches cluttered with coils, resistors, and half-finished wooden boxes. Here, the man who could barely afford bread turned necessity into invention, and a half-deaf engineer who was always humming to himself joined him in this cramped space. Together, they experimented constantly, sometimes failing when amps hissed or cracked, and sometimes discovering by accident the warmth of a tone that would later define an entire generation of musicians. The sound of a VOX amp wasn't taught in any school or learned from any textbook. It was discovered through trial and error, through countless hours of patient work in a workshop that smelled of soldering flux mixed with fresh wood shavings. Fingers blackened by varnish and metal dust became the instruments of creation, and in this small London workshop where the world's ears would one day pay attention, the signature jangle and chime of the first VOX amps were born modestly and quietly, waiting for their moment to change everything. Word spread slowly at first, not through advertising or marketing campaigns, but through the simple power of great sound. A local club picked up a small order, and a young guitarist wrote back, thrilled beyond words, saying it's like the amp is singing. By now, the team had grown to a dozen workers, young men and women who smelled the warm metal of freshly wound transformers and the sweetness of new lacquer on speaker cabinets, each one contributing their own skill and pride to the growing company. The first factory floor was a cacophony of life filled with the sounds of hammers, saws, and the occasional crash of a dropped speaker, and every amp that left the building carried with it a little pulse of London, a little heartbeat of ambition and craftsmanship. By the late 1950s, British musicians were beginning to notice VOX amps finding their way into the hands of players who would later change rock music forever, and it was still small-scale and humble. But the sound had power, and power has a way of attracting attention from those who knew quality when they heard it. The 1960s were coming alive with energy and possibility, and Beatlemania swept the world like nothing anyone had ever seen before, with VOX becoming a part of that unstoppable cultural phenomenon. The factory hummed day and night to keep up with the incredible demand, and managers walked the factory floor, smelling the sharp tang of solder flux, the sweetness of varnish, and the metallic warmth of freshly assembled transformers, watching as the company grew beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Musicians arrived at the factory, some shy and some brash, all wanting to see the place where their sound was born. And stories were whispered through the industry about a guitarist staying late to test an amp or a roadie who slept on the floor to protect a shipment of precious equipment. The sound wasn't just in the music itself, it was in the factory, in the rhythm of hands and machines working together, in the pride of every worker who understood they were part of something truly special and historic. Not through one catastrophe, but through a slow convergence of talent, obsession, and perfect timing, VOX became the defining sound of a generation, the amplifier of choice for musicians who wanted to be heard above everything else. By the early 1970s, VOX had climbed higher than anyone had imagined possible when Thomas Jennings was soldering wires in that basement decades before. The company won the Queen's Award for export, exporting amps to every continent on Earth, and the purpose-built factory on Earth's industrial edge hummed with 300 workers moving in perfect orchestration. Vertical integration meant everything was made in-house, from transformers to valves to cabinetry to wiring, giving VOX complete control over quality and sound. Rock stars strolled casually among the benches like Freddie Mercury might laugh at a misbehaving amp, or Brian May would linger to watch the hand-wiring process, understanding they were witnessing true craftsmanship. Machines clanked, solder melted, and wood dust floated in beams of sunlight streaming through the factory windows, creating a cathedral of sound where every worker understood their importance. At this height, VOX was more than a company. It was a living, breathing organism of British industry at its finest, representing everything that was best about manufacturing and design. Yet even at the summit, small cracks were forming, invisible to anyone looking only at awards and export numbers, cracks that would eventually widen into chasms. Inside the factory, mornings smelled of warm metal, flux, and fresh wood, while late afternoons brought the sharp tang of plating chemicals and the sweet haze of lacquer settling on finished products. Sounds were everywhere, surrounding the workers constantly. Amps thrummed as they were tested, staples hammered into cabinet backs, hammers tapped transformers into place with precision developed through years of practice. Workers moved in a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed, each person knowing exactly where the other would be, fingers blackened with solder and faces speckled with wood dust, wearing their work like badges of honor. Pride was palpable in every corner of the factory. Every amp carried the imprint of the hands that built it, and young apprentices learned the language of the shop: buzz, hum, resonance, as if it were a foreign language that unlocked the secrets of great sound. It was alive, a symphony of industry where human and mechanical elements existed in perfect harmony, yet even here, the first whispers of strain could be felt. The first hints that this perfect orchestration might not last forever, no matter how strong it seemed. But corporate changes arrived like shadows creeping across the factory floor, bringing with them new owners who saw only profits and not the craft that had built the company. Money was siphoned off into unrelated ventures that had nothing to do with making great amplifiers, and orders came down for cheaper materials that cut corners and compromised quality. The sound had to be modernized, according to the new management, which meant hand wiring was replaced with printed circuit boards that could be made faster and cheaper but without the character that made VOX famous. The factory still hummed, but the energy was different, the air felt heavier, and conversations of pride became quiet grumbles of worry about the future. A spirit that had seemed indestructible was starting to feel fragile, and not through one catastrophe but through a slow retreat of control, a convergence of short-term thinking overriding decades of care and attention to detail. The 1980s brought new pressures from all directions, crushing the company between forces it could not control. Cheaper solid-state technology was becoming the industry standard, Japanese competitors were undercutting prices everywhere. And shifting musical tastes meant that VOX could no longer rely on the old strengths that had made it legendary. Outsourcing began in earnest, with parts made abroad and assembly happening elsewhere, sacrificing craftsmanship for profit margins that satisfied shareholders but alienated the musicians who loved the brand. Cultural shifts eroded the brand's identity as punk wanted raw power while synthesizers wanted sterile precision, and every takeover by new owners left a little less of the original company intact. Hand-wired circuits became mass-produced boards, and cabinets shipped from overseas replaced those cut in London, and while the sound was still there technically, it felt thinner, quieter, more brittle, lacking the warmth that had made VOX special. The factory workers who had spent their entire lives building these amps knew something was wrong, but they were powerless to stop the slide toward irrelevance. By the late 1980s, the end was inevitable and everyone could see it coming like a train you cannot stop. Council orders for demolition came through, distributors failed, and bankruptcy loomed over the company like a death sentence. Decisions were painfully difficult, and the factory, the very heart of VOX that had pumped life and sound into the brand for decades, had to close its doors forever. Workers, some who had spent their entire careers at the benches, who knew every machine and every process intimately, were sent home for the last time, their expertise suddenly worthless in a world that no longer valued it. It was quiet now, the buzz and hum of the factory replaced by silence, the silence of loss and ending, and not through one catastrophe but through a long degradation of care, attention, and love for the craft that had defined the company since its inception. The amps would continue to exist in various forms, manufactured elsewhere, but the soul of the factory, the pulse of London hands and minds and hearts, was gone forever, and nothing could bring it back. The factory was demolished, erased from the landscape as if it had never mattered, and where transformers once hummed with life and purpose, a retail park now stood, dedicated to commerce and consumption of goods that had nothing to do with music or craft. Tooling lay abandoned in storage facilities, rusting slowly and forgotten, and there was no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement of what had been lost, no recognition of the thousands of workers whose skills and dedication had created something special. The workers, scattered across industries and cities, carried memories that no photograph could fully capture, memories of the smell of flux and wood and varnish, the sound of machines, the feeling of being part of something important. The air that once smelled of flux, wood, and varnish was replaced with the scent of asphalt and petrol, and the sound of music testing gave way to the sound of trolleys clattering over concrete, a legend erased from the physical world but not from the memories of those who lived through it. Today, VOX survives in name alone, a shell of what it once was, with cheap imports and foreign factories trying to conjure nostalgia through marketing campaigns that ring hollow. But the soul is missing, the British hands that gave warmth and unpredictability and life to the amps are gone, and the heritage feels hollow, the story faint, and the sound noticeably thinner than it once was. It is a ghost walking among neon signs and mass-market stores, trying to remind people of a past it can no longer authentically represent. And not through one catastrophe but through the slow degradation of care and attention, the brand has become a shadow of itself, a memory of what it once meant. Yet the sound lives on in old recordings made by legends, and vintage amps that survive in basements and studios around the world, and the reverberation of stadiums that once shook with VOX-powered riffs that changed music forever. The founder's stubbornness, the worker's pride, the smell of varnish and warm metal, these things remain in echoes and in memory and in the music itself, preserved not in factories but in the hearts of musicians and fans. The factory and the brand and the people may be gone from this world, but the sound itself, the stubborn chime, the voice of British craft and innovation, remembers. And as long as someone plugs in an old VOX and listens to what it can do, the legacy endures, not triumphant, not perfect, but quietly persistent in a world that too often forgets what matters most.